It's rank hypocrisy. He knows that the House of Lords is extremely unpopular now, generally, amongst the electorate. The cronyism and the methods by which, you know, people are elevated. I'm not saying all peerages, by the way, granted in that way, but you know, there's a really strong whiff now about the House of Lords, and I think it's going to be very hard to shift it. I suspect Gordon Brown would accept a peerage. I'd be very surprised if Tony Blair does.
Of course he'll accept it.
And I'll tell you why. Well, I'll tell you why, Nana, I don't think he will.
Well, except Tony Blair will accept it.
I'll tell you. I tell you why he might not, and it's because he's making so much money outside the Lords. And of course, if you become a peer, you then become subject to all the same scrutiny that Boris Johnson was scrutinised. You know, the Privileges Committee. You have to make disclosure about where you're making your money and how you're making it, from whom you're getting it. And Blair, I suspect, is making a lot more money from a lot more areas than he'd like us to know. So I'd be surprised. I find it abominable that he was given the highest order of knighthood of the Garter after his time in office, given what he did to the country and the world while he was in office.
Peter?
Well, I disagree with most of that. First of all, I don't think Tony Blair was a war criminal, but clearly I think the invasion of Iraq was a disaster. But let's not spend half an hour on that now. In terms of the Lord's story, I think, who knows what will happen, but you have to bear in mind, so Labour are ahead in the opinion polls. Labour could be the next government, but they're not taking that for granted. But then they'll run up, as many new governments do, against the number of Tory and crossbench peers. It would make it very difficult to get certain bits of legislation through Parliament, other than any that are explicitly stated in the manifesto, which the Lords will be duty-bound to support. So every Prime Minister of a new government tends to ennoble their own party, so that's normal. And every former Prime Minister tends to be offered a peerage as well, so that's also normal. I actually think Gordon Brown, who I think was a fantastic Chancellor, but he lived a kind of famously ascetic life. The one thing where we could disagree, or you might disagree, with Gordon Brown on some of the politics, no one's ever accused him of being in it for status or money. He lived quite an ascetic life and continues to do so. So I'm not sure he'd take up a peerage.
Do you remember that bigoted woman phrase that he made when he didn't realise the mic was up?
And he apologised, and we all make mistakes, nothing wrong with apologising. But that's a bit of a cheap shot. And then on Tony Blair's point...
It's not a cheap shot, it's the truth. I'm just reminding you, because you were saying how great he is. I just remembered that.
We all make mistakes, and I think it's good to apologise. But Ben Habib made a point about Tony Blair. So Tony Blair did make a lot of money, that's undoubted, but he's largely wound down business enterprises and put the money into the Tony Blair Institute. So, yes, he did make a lot of money. We don't know how much. But I don't think the disclosure should be a problem now, because he's funnelled most of his wealth into the kind of think tank charitable enterprises.
So
funnelled, I like the word funnelled. He's funnelled his wealth into a think tank, so that's all good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree largely with what Peter said about Gordon Brown. I think he was a lousy Chancellor, but he did what he did because he believed in it. Tony Blair, on the other hand, he sold gold at the bottom. And remember, when that government left office, the country was effectively bankrupt. You know, government debt had reached astronomical levels as it was then, and if it hadn't been for the printing of money and the bailing out of banks and the very people who created the credit crunch, we would have gone bust in 2008. And in many ways, the ills that we're now experiencing in our economy can be traced back to the breaking of capitalism back in 2008. And that was all under light touch, light touch regulation of the banks by Gordon Brown. He used to say it, light touch regulation, that's what they said.
Well, remember Liam Byrne's nice little note that I'm afraid there's no money left. That's how they left it, didn't it?
If you want to debate the events of 15 years ago, there was a global financial crisis. The Labour government did not bring down Lehman Brothers, which was, if you like, the canary in the coal mine. And we know COVID was devastating. That generated a global health and financial crisis. And people on the right didn't like this phrase, global crisis, in 2008. Well, but then we've had another global crisis, and people have to accept that it existed.
No, but listen, politicians can't absolve themselves of all responsibility when something outside affects our internal politics. They have to take responsibility for the decisions they're made based on the things that are happening. And I think in politics, a lot of that goes on when they messed up quantitating easing. There was too much money coming in.
And I'm afraid...
But that's not a government decision. Sorry, QE is a Bank of England decision.
But they're all working together.
Come on, Peter. QE took place hand in glove. Government, Bank of England, they talk about the independence of the Bank of England. Every pound of government debt that was issued in the great financial crash, or whatever they call it, was bought by the Bank of England. And you talk about it as being a global crash. It was a global crash created largely by the United Kingdom and the US. So you can't wash Gordon Brown's hands of this. Of course it was global, because we are a significant contributor to the global economy and the global financial system. What the UK does matters, and Gordon Brown was at the centre of the creation of those problems. They have to take responsibility for it. And they broke capitalism. That's what happened in 2008.
This phrase "broke capitalism" is close to meaningless. And Ben,
no, it's not meaningless.
Peter,
it's not meaningless.
Calm and reasonable, but I can see he's getting very exercised and upset about this.
I'm not.
There was
It's a fact.
Well, Ben, it's the first time I've heard you shout at me. You're always very calm and friendly.
No, I wasn't shouting. Sorry.
Okay.
Forgive
He
me.
wasn't shouting.
No problem.
Yeah.
No problem.
He wasn't shouting.
There was a global financial crisis. If you read Gordon Brown's book, I think him and Emballs accept banking regulation in Britain should have been tighter. But we are where we are. Should Britain have bailed out the banks, or should Britain have let NatWest and RBS shut down? The consequences of that would have been a disaster if RBS had closed.
It's not really worked out well.
He kept the British economy going.
Well, it's not worked out well, and that's what I say.
What do you mean by that? It's not worked out well.
Well, it hasn't, has it? Look where we are now, and the banks seem to be taking advantage of the situation once again. When interest rates are going up, they're not passing it on to the savers. But we will talk about that.
That's nothing to do with the bailout, though, is it?